A black woman, polished and confident, steps up to the priority boarding gate, ready to take her seat in first class. She hands over her platinum membership card, a quiet symbol of the success she's built. But instead of a smile, the gate agent narrows her eyes. "This card doesn't look right," the agent says, loud enough for the crowd behind her to hear. The woman stays calm, insisting the card is valid because she designed the program herself. But the agent won't back down. Security is called, people whisper, and for 7 long minutes, the woman stands there, dignity intact, but patience wearing thin. Then, just as suddenly as it began, everything changes. A senior executive arrives, recognizes the woman immediately, and the entire gate crew is escorted out on the spot. What happened next left everyone watching in stunned silence and sparked a firestorm that shook the airline's entire leadership. Stay with me, this is a story you won't forget. Let us know where you're watching from. And if this hits home, like and subscribe for more stories that demand to be told. Airports have a peculiar way of exposing the hidden gears of society. Beneath the polished tile floors and glowing departure boards lies something far less glossy, a friction that reveals itself in the small, passing moments. At Gate 14, that friction emerged as soon as Amara Collins stepped forward. Card in hand, Amara was the kind of woman who turned heads without effort. Not because of any ostentation but because of the quiet assurance that followed her like an echo. She dressed sharply but without vanity, her fitted blazer and crisp trousers a reflection of years spent climbing a corporate ladder with rungs not built for her. Her hair, cropped close, framed a face that carried the weariness of one who had been here before. In 100 different ways. In places far from any airport. Behind the counter stood Lisa Morris, her uniform neatly pressed, the airline's name pinned carefully to her chest as if proximity to authority might lend her some. Lisa glanced up, taking in Amara's approach the way one might inspect a build too crisp to be trusted. Her eyes didn't linger long on Amara's face. They dropped to the platinum membership card, small, unobtrusive, but gleaming. It caught the harsh fluorescent light and for a brief moment, seemed to shine too brightly. Lisa's fingers hovered over the card, hesitant, as if by touching it she might confirm the suspicion already forming in the back of her mind. The line behind Amara shuffled impatiently. But Lisa's world narrowed to just this: her, the card, and the woman standing before her. "This doesn't look right," Lisa said finally. The words dropped into the space between them with the subtle weight of something meant to bruise, not break. Amara tilted her head slightly, her smile thinning but not disappearing. "It's active," Amara replied, her tone measured. "I've been a member for years." Lisa's mouth tightened at the corners. She had not expected calm. She had expected flustered explanations, hurried backpedaling, anything but the poise that now stared back at her. "For years, huh?" Lisa's thumb rubbed against the card's edge. "Strange. This looks fake to me." The murmurs behind Amara grew louder, the line shifting as people craned their necks just enough to witness without committing fully to involvement. It was the same old performance, one that had played out long before Lisa's birth. But Lisa did not know she was part of a performance. To her, this was just a precaution, a necessary one. She told herself, "I can assure you it's genuine," Amara said, her voice steady. "You can verify it in your system." Lisa's smile didn't reach her eyes. She turned to the line of passengers behind Amara, lifting her voice just enough for them to catch the performance unfolding. "We've been seeing a lot of these counterfeit cards lately. You'd be surprised how far some people will go for first class." The reaction rippled quietly. A man 2 places down shifted his weight, his eyes flicking to Amara, then away. Another adjusted his watch as if the moment would pass more quickly if he looked at anything but the woman in front of him. Amara's chest tightened, not from surprise but from the weight of repetition. This wasn't new. This wasn't even rare. What Lisa did not know, what she could not have known, was that the card she questioned had been designed by the very woman holding it. "Call your supervisor," Amara said, her voice unwavering. Lisa's smirk flickered. "I'll call security." And with those words, the script wrote itself. The officer approached, broad-shouldered, wearing the kind of expression that belonged to men who had been called into rooms where their presence was less about assistance and more about optics. His badge caught the light just as Amara's card had. But no one questioned its authenticity. "Problem here?" the officer asked, addressing Lisa but letting his gaze settle on Amara. "Yes," Lisa said briskly, as if relieved to find an ally. "This woman's trying to use a fake membership card." Amara met the officer's gaze. "I'm asking for verification. That's all." The officer nodded, but the weight of his glance lingered on Amara longer than necessary. He motioned for her to step aside. Amara complied, her movements deliberate, her posture erect. She had long since learned that to shrink under the weight of accusation was to confirm it. She would not give them that satisfaction. As she waited, the sound of her phone vibrating against the leather of her bag brought a momentary reprieve. Amara lifted it to her ear. "This is Amara Collins. I need this escalated immediately." Gate 14. The eyes behind the counter narrowed. Lisa's smirk returned, smaller this time but no less sharp. "Oh great," Lisa muttered loud enough for the crowd to catch. "She's pretending to have connections now." Amara didn't respond. There were no words for ignorance wrapped so tightly in authority. She had learned long ago that silence could carry the weight of 1,000 rebuttals. Minutes stretched long, the air thick with judgment and something older. Something that had followed Amara's footsteps long before Lisa Morris ever existed. But the gears of the world had shifted. Unseen to Lisa, the call had already reached Jordan Reynolds, and as the executive strode down the terminal, the performance neared its final act. When Jordan arrived, his eyes flicked from Amara to Lisa. The shift in his expression, barely perceptible, was all Amara needed to know. The ending was already written. "Miss Collins," Jordan said, extending his hand, "I apologize for the misunderstanding." And just like that, the curtain fell. But Amara knew better than to believe it was over. The stage might change, the actors might rotate, but the play itself? It would return, just as it always had. The thing about waiting rooms, airports, bus stations, or anywhere else time holds people hostage, is that they are rarely just about waiting. They are places where the world decides who deserves to move forward and who must sit still. Amara Collins stood to the side of the priority gate, her arms folded, eyes fixed somewhere just beyond the horizon of glass windows. The runway stretched out in front of her, but it may as well have been the Atlantic. Wide and indifferent, Lisa Morris returned to her post behind the counter. Her smile thin but triumphant, the smugness of small victories playing across her face. The passengers shifted, eyes flicking between their phones and Amara, who stood like a monument to something they all recognized but wouldn't name. A woman in a blue cardigan whispered to her husband. He nodded slowly, never looking up. An older man near the front glanced at Amara and then away. Quickly enough to convince himself he had not been complicit in this small theater of humiliation. Amara wasn't new to this. She had spent her life inside rooms like these, rooms that whispered their prejudices, their doubts, rooms where the air felt thicker when she entered. She glanced at the clock. 3 minutes since she'd placed the call. It was a quiet reassurance, like tracing the spine of a well-read book. The security officer lingered a few feet away, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was doing his job, Amara supposed, but there was something about the way his eyes rested on her that felt familiar, not protective, not inquisitive, just expectant. The waiting stretched, tightening the air. Amara could feel Lisa's gaze brushing against her, the small flickers of satisfaction that came from imagining she had just restored the natural order of things. But Amara wasn't leaving. She stayed planted there, not as a protest, but as a refusal to fold inward, to make herself smaller, to disappear into the crowd the way the world often wanted her to. Her phone buzzed softly in her palm. "Ms. Collins, we've notified the executive office. They're sending someone immediately." Amara exhaled. "Just a small thing, thank you." Lisa glanced up from her screen, her smirk catching the edge of Amara's calm. "You know," Lisa said to no one in particular, "people fake these cards all the time. I guess some folks just think the rules don't apply to them." Her voice carried just enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Amara's eyes didn't move from the window. "I wouldn't know about that," she replied, her tone like steel wrapped in velvet. Lisa's smirk twitched. The security officer shifted his weight. He was young enough to seem unsure, old enough to recognize that whatever was unfolding in front of him was bigger than his authority. And still, the gate continued its ordinary rhythm. Passengers came and went, their tickets scanned, their bags checked, their movements uninterrupted by anything but the faint inconvenience of being a spectator to someone else's embarrassment. Amara caught the gaze of a flight attendant passing by. The woman, blonde and brisk, flicked her eyes to Lisa, then to Amara, and offered the smallest nod. It wasn't much, but it was something. 10 minutes. Amara's feet ached, but she didn't shift. It wasn't just about this card. It wasn't about the smirk on Lisa's face or the quiet judgment in the eyes of the passengers. It was about the weight of every airport, every conference room, every sidewalk where the world slowed down just enough to ask her to prove she belonged there. She thought of her grandmother, who had once told her, "You can't let them make you doubt your own skin." At the time, Amara hadn't fully understood. Now, it lived with her like a second heartbeat. The executive arrived not with fanfare but with the briskness of someone who knew damage control by muscle memory. His suit was sharp, and his smile was professional. But there was something in the way his eyes met Amara's that betrayed recognition. "Miss Collins," he said, offering his hand, "I apologize for the delay. I'm Jordan Reynolds, Vice President of Customer Relations." Lisa's posture shifted, her smirk thinned, replaced by the careful mask of someone who suddenly realized she'd misjudged the temperature of the room. Amara shook Jordan's hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for coming." Jordan turned to Lisa. "Could you explain what happened here?" Lisa straightened. "I was just following protocol." "Sir." The card seemed suspicious. Jordan's eyes narrowed, though his voice remained calm. "And did you verify it in the system?" Lisa hesitated. Security." "You didn't." Jordan interrupted, his words cut clean, not angry, but absolute. Lisa's eyes darted to Amara, then back to Jordan. "I'll handle this from here," Jordan said. Lisa nodded stiffly and returned to her post. As Jordan turned back to Amara, his voice softened. "Ms. Collins, I apologize sincerely. Your membership card is, of course, valid. This shouldn't have happened." Amara's lips pressed together in something like a smile, though the warmth never quite reached her eyes. "I appreciate that, Jordan," she said, "but this isn't just about me." Jordan held her gaze for a long moment, and Amara could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "No," he said quietly. "It isn't." The real trouble began when the apologies started. Jordan Reynolds, with his crisp suit and carefully measured words, had escorted Amara to a quiet lounge just beyond the gate. The room was sterile, dotted with artificial plants and soft leather chairs that did little to soften the edges of the moment. Jordan lowered himself into the seat across from her, his hands folding neatly atop the table. His presence carried the weight of the airline's goodwill, polished and distant, like a gift wrapped just tight enough to feel impersonal. "Again, Ms. Collins," he began, his voice even. "I deeply regret the misunderstanding. It's unacceptable, and we'll be addressing it internally." Amara crossed one leg over the other, her eyes steady. She had been here before. Not in this lounge, not with this particular man, but in this posture on the receiving end of well-oiled regret that hummed like clockwork. "I'm sure you will," Amara replied. Her tone was soft, but it moved like water against stone, gentle, persistent. Jordan offered a polite nod, one that hinted at relief. He was hoping this could be the end of it. The moment neatly packed away as if it had been nothing more than a spilled cup of coffee at check-in. But Amara wasn't done. "I'd like to ask you something, Jordan," she said, leaning forward just enough to unsettle the equilibrium between them. Jordan straightened slightly. "Of course." She held up the membership card, letting it catch the overhead light. The same card Lisa had dismissed only minutes earlier now glinted like a blade between them. "What did you see when you looked at me out there?" she asked. Jordan blinked, his practiced expression slipping for just a second. "I'm not sure I understand." "You understood perfectly when you walked up to that counter," Amara said, her gaze narrowing. "You saw me. You saw Lisa. And you understood exactly what happened before anyone said a word. I could see it on your face." Jordan hesitated, the veneer of professionalism thinned. And for the first time, his shoulders sagged under the weight of what had already passed between them. "I won't deny that," Jordan admitted quietly. "But you know how these things are." Amara tilted her head, the corner of her mouth lifting in a humorless smile. "I do," she said. "That's the problem." The lounge seemed smaller now, the air heavier. Jordan shifted in his seat, his hands tightening over the table's edge. He was a man accustomed to solving problems with just the right blend of formality and distance. But Amara wasn't asking for formality. She was asking for something far more dangerous: honesty. "Ms. Collins," Jordan began carefully, "I don't think Lisa meant any harm." Sometimes people make assumptions without realizing. There it is, Amara interrupted, her voice cutting through his like a razor. That word, assumptions. Jordan's mouth closed, his lips pressing into a thin line. Let me tell you something about assumptions. Jordan, Amara continued, her eyes locking onto his. Assumptions are the architecture of racism. They're built quietly, brick by brick, until one day you find yourself standing in a house you didn't even realize you helped construct. Jordan's gaze dropped for just a moment, but Amara pressed forward. Lisa didn't accuse me of fraud because she knew anything about me. She accused me because the house she lives in told her that women like me don't stand at the front of the line. And you. Amara's voice softened, but the sharpness remained. You knew it too. That's why you apologized without needing the details. Jordan's fingers tapped once against the table, a nervous rhythm betraying the crack in his armor. This isn't just about Lisa, Amara said, leaning back but never breaking eye contact. She's not the architect. She's just the tenant, and so are you. The silence between them stretched, taut and unyielding. I don't deny that, Jordan said finally, his voice low. But what do you want me to do? Amara? Fire her? Make an example of her? Amara studied him for a long moment. She could see the exhaustion lining his face, the tightrope he walked between the reality of the situation and the corporate walls he had been tasked with upholding. No, Amara replied softly. Firing Lisa won't fix the house. Jordan exhaled, nodding slowly. Then what will? Amara glanced down at the card still resting between them. She traced its edge with her thumb, her thoughts unspooling like thread. You're the vice president of customer relations, she said. I imagine you've got a lot of meetings. A lot of reports that talk about diversity and inclusion. Jordan gave a small, reluctant smile. We do. Good, Amara replied, pocketing the card. Then I'll see you at the next one. Jordan blinked. I'm sorry? You want to know what will fix it? Amara stood, straightening her blazer. Invite me to the table. Jordan, let me help you see the parts of the house you've never had to notice. Jordan rose slowly, watching her with a mixture of apprehension and something else, respect. Perhaps, or curiosity. I'll talk to the board, Jordan said carefully. I can't make promises, but I can open the door. Amara smiled, but this time there was warmth behind it. That's all I'm asking for. As she turned to leave, Jordan's voice called after her. Ms. Collins. Amara paused, glancing over her shoulder. Thank you, Jordan said quietly, for not walking away. Amara's eyes softened, but her voice remained steady. I've been here too long to walk away now. The door closed behind her, but Amara knew the house was still standing. It always was, but perhaps, for the first time, someone had seen the cracks. Amara Collins wasn't naive. The apology, the promise of a meeting, those were surface ripples. The kind that barely skimmed the deeper waters below. Jordan Reynolds, for all his careful words and corporate guilt, wasn't the final obstacle. He was merely the first stone on a long road paved with just enough regret to keep things from catching fire. She left the lounge, her heels tapping against the glossy airport floor. The air felt thinner out here, stretched taut by the weight of what had just transpired. But Amara wasn't one to linger in the soft spaces where victories pretended to bloom. Out there, Lisa Morris was still behind the counter, moving as though nothing had shifted. A professional mask had slipped back into place. But Amara noticed the slight stiffness in Lisa's shoulders, the way her gaze never quite lifted as passengers passed. For Lisa, the day had already been cut into two halves, the part before Amara, and the part after. Amara approached the gate, not to escalate, not to extend some fragile olive branch, but because she knew better than to let silence settle where noise belonged. Lisa glanced up, startled by Amara's return. Ms. Collins, she said, clearing her throat. Is there something I can? I don't need anything from you. Lisa. Amara's voice was soft, but her words hung with a gravity Lisa couldn't escape. Lisa's mouth opened, then closed. You won't remember this as just a misunderstanding. Amara continued. You'll remember it as the day someone stood where you thought they shouldn't. And I imagine that'll stay with you longer than the apology you didn't give. Lisa's hands fidgeted by the keyboard, but she said nothing. Amara nodded once, not in dismissal, but in something closer to acknowledgement, the kind reserved for people who had yet to see the full reflection of themselves. But airports are never still. Behind Amara, the hum of boarding announcements crackled through the terminal. Life surged forward as it always did. sweeping past small confrontations like leaves in the wind. Amara's flight was boarding. She moved toward the jet bridge, past passengers who kept their eyes low and luggage pressed close, silent witnesses to something they did not wish to inherit. But even as Amara settled into her seat, the weight of Lisa's gaze seemed to follow her, stretching across rows of unbothered passengers. This wasn't over. The second call came 3 days later. As Amara sat in her office overlooking the city, the phone vibrated against the wood grain of her desk. And when she answered, Jordan's voice greeted her, not rushed, but quieter than she expected. "We've scheduled the meeting," Jordan said. "Good," Amara replied, barely looking up from the notes she had been drafting. Jordan hesitated. "Some of the board members are hesitant about your involvement." Amara smiled without humor. "Of course they are. It's not personal," Jordan added quickly. "The way people do when they are aware of exactly how personal something is." "Jordan," Amara said, setting down her pen, "I know how this works. You want me in the room to show the airline is serious. But not too serious. I'm the right shade of concerned. But not disruptive. Is that about right?" There was silence on the other end, heavy and telling. "I need you there," Jordan said finally. Amara exhaled slowly. "I'll be there." The meeting wasn't held at the airport. Instead, Amara found herself seated at a polished mahogany table in the upper floors of the airline's corporate headquarters. The room was spacious, with panoramic windows that stretched too far for comfort, as if someone thought a good view might absolve them of responsibility. Around her sat a collection of executives, men and women who had spent their careers learning the fine art of avoidance. They nodded politely when she entered, their eyes flicking toward Jordan as though he might offer some unspoken reassurance. Jordan sat 2 seats down, his expression more measured than the last time they spoke. He wasn't guiding this meeting. This was above him now. "Ms. Collins," one of the older men said, offering a practiced smile, "thank you for taking the time. We understand there was an incident at the airport." Amara settled in her chair, resting her hands lightly on the table. "It wasn't an incident," she corrected. "It was a reflection." The man blinked, and a thin crease formed between his brows. "A reflection of what, exactly?" he asked. Amara tilted her head, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make them uncomfortable. "Your company," she replied, "and the people you hired to represent it." The air grew heavier, as it always did when truth entered spaces unprepared to house it. "We're committed to improving our diversity and inclusion initiatives," another board member said, his voice gentle but firm. "These situations are rare." "They're not rare," Amara interrupted, her gaze sharp. "They're just rarely addressed. There's a difference." Jordan glanced at her but said nothing. He knew better now. "I didn't come here to hear about initiatives," Amara continued. "I came to ask why it took a phone call to an executive before I was treated like I belonged in the line I paid to stand in." The older man across from her shifted in his chair, his discomfort apparent. "Ms. Collins," he began carefully, "you have to understand, Lisa Morris was acting on instinct. Sometimes mistakes happen. People get nervous, especially with increased security measures these days." Amara smiled faintly. "I understand instinct better than you think." She let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "Instinct isn't neutral. It's built. And for people like Lisa, instinct looks like doubt when someone like me steps forward. You can call it a mistake, but I call it what it is: conditioning." No one spoke for a long moment. Jordan finally leaned forward, his hands clasped. "What do you propose, Amara?" Amara glanced out the window, the city stretching below like an unfinished story. "I propose you stop patching cracks and start rebuilding the foundation." She turned back to face them, her voice unwavering. "That begins with accountability. And accountability begins with facing the truth no matter how uncomfortable it makes you." No one applauded, but no one argued either. In the silence, Amara found something rare: a flicker of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The thing about truth is that it rarely arrives with a red carpet. More often, it slips into rooms uninvited, disrupting conversations that had been carefully rehearsed. And when it does, it asks for things that no one is ready to give. Amara Collins walked out of that boardroom with the kind of quiet that follows people who have said more than the room wanted to hear. The polished floors echoed under her heels as she passed rows of glass offices, where people who hadn't been part of the meeting watched her leave with polite curiosity. By the time she reached the elevator, Jordan Reynolds had caught up to her, You didn't have to push them that hard, Jordan said, though his voice carried no anger. If anything, there was something like admiration buried beneath his words. But Amara wasn't in the mood for it. Didn't I? She replied without turning. Jordan stepped into the elevator beside her, pressing the button for the ground floor. They'll listen, he said after a beat. It'll take time, but they'll move on it. Amara exhaled slowly, watching the numbers light up as the elevator descended. That's the difference between you and me, Jordan, she said. I don't have the luxury of waiting for them to move on it. Jordan didn't argue. He knew enough to understand that people like him, people who lived comfortably in the middle, could afford patience. But patience, Amara had learned long ago, was a privilege. The elevator doors slid open, and the hum of the lobby greeted them. Jordan followed her out, his steps slower now, as if debating whether to continue the conversation. Look, he said, running a hand over the back of his neck. I'm doing what I can from where I stand. But you know how this works. Change at this level is incremental. Amara finished for him. Yes, Jordan, I know. She stopped in the middle of the lobby, turning to face him fully. But you need to understand something too. Every time you ask someone like me to wait for incremental change, what you're really asking is for me to bear the cost of your learning curve. Jordan's lips parted, but the words never came. Amara's eyes softened just slightly, though her voice didn't lose its edge. You don't need to fix the whole house, Jordan, but you need to stop pretending that the foundation isn't cracked. Before he could respond, Amara turned and walked toward the glass doors, leaving him standing there with his hands in his pockets, watching her go. The following week, Amara's inbox filled with messages she didn't need to read to understand. The board had agreed tentatively, carefully, to implement new bias training across all major airports where the airline operated. The announcement came with the usual corporate language, designed to sound bold without being inflammatory. Words like commitment and growth were thrown around generously, while the word racism never made an appearance. Lisa Morris, the gate agent, had been quietly reassigned to another terminal. She hadn't been fired, of course not. No one was interested in making a martyr out of her. But she wouldn't stand behind the priority boarding desk anytime soon. It was what corporations like to call resolution. And yet, Amara felt no sense of victory. One afternoon, while reviewing policy documents the airline had sent her for feedback, Amara received an email from Jordan. It was short. I thought you'd want to know Lisa requested a meeting with our. She asked about returning to the gate next month. HR's asking if you'd be willing to meet with her first. Amara stared at the message for a long time, the cursor blinking like a question mark she wasn't ready to answer. She closed the laptop and let the quiet settle. 2 days later, Amara sat in a small conference room at the airport, the same terminal where the confrontation had unfolded. This time, there was no audience, just her and Lisa Morris, seated across from one another at a table that felt far too large for the space it occupied. Lisa's posture was stiff, her hands folded so tightly that her knuckles whitened. I wasn't sure you'd agree to this, Lisa said, her voice quiet but clear. Amara rested her hands lightly on the table. Neither was I. Lisa nodded, staring at a spot just past Amara's shoulder. I've been doing the training, Lisa said, as if offering proof of penance. The diversity programs, all of it. Amara raised an eyebrow. And? Lisa hesitated. It's eye-opening. I didn't realize how much of this I'd never noticed before. That's the nature of privilege, Amara replied calmly. It lets you live inside a world you don't have to name. Lisa shifted in her seat, the weight of Amara's words settling into the space between them. I wasn't trying to be malicious, Lisa said quietly. I know it felt that way. But I was just following the protocols, I thought. You thought you were protecting the integrity of the system. Amara interrupted. I know. Lisa's eyes finally lifted to meet Amara's, and for the first time, Amara saw something beyond defensiveness, uncertainty. The problem, Amara continued, her voice softening, is that systems are only as good as the people enforcing them. And too often, people like me get caught under the weight of those blind spots. Lisa nodded slowly, though she said nothing. They sat in silence for a long while, neither rushing to fill the void. Finally, Lisa spoke. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said. I know that's not my place. But I wanted you to know that I'm trying. I really am. Amara studied her for a long moment, searching for the sincerity beneath Lisa's nervous exterior. I don't need you to apologize. Amara replied. I need you to carry what you've learned forward. When someone else stands at that counter, I need you to see them fully. Lisa swallowed, her eyes shimmering with something that looked like relief. I will, Lisa promised. Amara rose, gathering her things. Good. Before leaving the room, Amara paused by the door. Lisa, she said over her shoulder. It's not enough to change how you see me. You need to change how you see the world. Lisa nodded, her expression unreadable but thoughtful. As Amara stepped back into the terminal, she felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only the quiet knowledge that the work, as always, would continue. The trouble with progress is that it rarely makes noise. It doesn't arrive with the fanfare of apology emails or corporate statements carefully massaged by public relations teams. No, real progress sneaks in quietly, unnoticed at first, like the faintest shift in the wind before a storm. Amara Collins knew this. She felt it in the days following her meeting with Lisa Morris, in the way the airport terminal felt unchanged on the surface, but carried something unspoken beneath it. There were no grand gestures, no public reckonings. Lisa returned to her station, but not to the same gate. And though Amara's inbox filled with polite thank yous from Jordan Reynolds and his team, the undertone of their messages hummed with the hope that perhaps now, finally, things could return to normal. But normal was the last thing Amara wanted. She found herself back at the airport 2 weeks later. Not for business, not for travel, but because sometimes the weight of unfinished things has a way of calling people back to where they left them. The terminal was no different than before, still the same polished floors. The same hurried travelers dragging their lives behind them in rolling suitcases. Amara stood near the coffee kiosk, stirring a cup she didn't particularly need, watching the rhythm of the gate she had once been denied entry to. A young woman, no older than 25, stood behind the counter now. Her smile was wide, her energy unburdened by the kind of exhaustion that had settled into Lisa's bones. She greeted passengers with the kind of ease that comes from never having been tested. Amara lingered for a moment, studying the way people approached her, how they smiled back, unquestioning, as their boarding passes were scanned without incident. For a brief second, Amara wondered what it felt like to move through life that way, to pass through doors without ever wondering if someone might try to close them. But that thought passed. Amara didn't envy that kind of innocence. It was too fragile, and fragile things, she had learned, didn't survive long. Ms. Collins? Amara turned at the sound of her name. Jordan Reynolds stood a few feet away, hands in the pockets of a dark navy coat. His expression was softer than usual, but the same cautious politeness lingered around him. I thought that was you, he said, offering a small nod. I didn't expect to see you here. Amara smiled faintly. Neither did I. Jordan glanced toward the gate, following her line of sight. Lisa's working at another terminal, he said, almost defensively. I know. They stood in silence, the noise of the terminal folding in around them. You think this changed anything? Jordan asked, his gaze fixed on the boarding line ahead. Amara sipped her coffee, letting the question settle. Maybe, she replied after a moment. But not in the way you're hoping. Jordan frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. What do you mean? Amara's gaze drifted back to the gate, to the young woman scanning tickets without hesitation. You're expecting some clean ending, she said. You want Lisa to learn, the board to pass their initiatives, and for all of this to fade into memory. But that's not how this works. Jordan exhaled, his breath visible in the cool air that seeped through the terminal's glass doors. I get that, he said, but there's only so much we can push at once. We're trying to change things without breaking them. Amara's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Maybe breaking them is the point, she replied softly. Jordan's eyes flicked toward her, something uncertain behind them. It's not about tearing it all down, Amara continued, her voice calm but unwavering. It's about making sure people like me don't have to carry the weight of keeping it standing. Jordan's shoulders tensed, but he said nothing. For a long time, they simply stood there, two people watching the same world from opposite shores. Finally, Jordan broke the silence. Lisa told me about your conversation, he said quietly. She said you didn't ask for an apology. Amara nodded. Apologies are easy, she replied. Accountability isn't. Jordan shifted his weight, his hands sliding deeper into his coat pockets. Do you think she'll change? He asked. Amara's eyes softened, though her answer carried no illusion. She'll try, she said, but trying isn't the same as succeeding. And even if she changes, the next Lisa is already out there waiting at another counter, holding the same doubts, carrying the same fears she doesn't even know she has. Jordan's expression darkened, the reality of Amara's words settling into him like cold air. That's the part you don't want to admit, Amara said gently. This isn't about one woman or one incident. It's about the air we all breathe, the things we inherit before we ever have the chance to question them. Jordan nodded slowly, his gaze distant. You're right, he admitted. Amara finished the last of her coffee, discarding the cup in a nearby bin. I know, she said softly. Before she could leave, Jordan spoke again. You think I'm part of the problem, don't you? Amara paused, turning back to face him fully. I think you're part of the system, she replied, whether you want to be or not. Jordan's mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. That doesn't mean you can't do something, Amara added, her eyes steady. It just means you'll have to work twice as hard to hear the things people won't say out loud. Jordan considered her words for a long moment, then offered a faint nod. I'll keep listening, he said. Amara smiled, though it was tinged with something bittersweet. Good, she replied, but remember, listening isn't enough. Jordan watched as Amara walked away, her figure blending into the crowd, leaving him standing alone in the middle of the bustling terminal. And as the gate agent continued to scan boarding passes, Jordan realized something Amara had likely known all along. Some weights aren't meant to be carried alone. Amara Collins had long understood that some doors stayed closed not because they were locked, but because too few people dared to push them open. The airport lounge was quiet this time, quieter than usual. She sat by the window, watching the slow crawl of planes taxiing across the tarmac, engines humming softly in the distance. The sky outside was turning that shade of pale blue that comes just before sunset, when the day hesitates on the edge of something darker. It had been a month since her last meeting with the airline board. Since then, policies had shifted incrementally, carefully, just as she expected. Jordan Reynolds, true to his word, had kept in touch, sending updates that felt more like status reports than progress. Still, the real work, the kind that couldn't fit into bullet points or spreadsheets, remained unfinished. Amara sipped her tea, the warmth spreading through her chest, though it did little to quiet the ache she carried. She wasn't tired in the way most people meant. It wasn't exhaustion from overwork or lack of sleep. It was the quiet fatigue of being a constant witness to a world that moved in circles, always returning to the same unspoken boundaries. Ms. Collins. Amara looked up to see Lisa Morris standing near the entrance of the lounge, her posture stiff with uncertainty. She hadn't expected to see her here. Lisa took a tentative step forward, clutching a folder tightly against her chest like a shield. Her uniform was pressed, her shoes polished, but something in her face betrayed the nervousness she hadn't yet learned to mask. Lisa, Amara said, motioning to the empty seat across from her. Please, sit. Lisa hesitated before lowering herself into the chair, setting the folder carefully on the table between them. For a few moments, neither woman spoke. I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again, Lisa admitted, her voice quieter than Amara remembered. Amara studied her, noting the way Lisa's fingers fidgeted with the edge of the folder, small movements that betrayed the weight she carried. I never wanted you gone, Amara replied evenly. I wanted you to understand. Lisa nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to the table. I've been thinking a lot, she said, about that day, about all of it. Amara waited, sensing that Lisa's words were only skimming the surface of something deeper. Lisa exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment she walked in. The truth is, she continued, her voice tightening, I didn't think I was one of those people. I told myself I was just doing my job. But after everything, after talking to after the training, I realized how much I wasn't seeing. Amara's eyes softened, though she remained silent. It's not just about you, Lisa admitted. It's about the hundreds of people I've interacted with over the years. How many times did I make them feel small without even realizing it? Lisa's voice cracked slightly, and she swallowed hard to steady herself. I thought if I followed the rules, I was doing the right thing, she said, but now I know, sometimes the rules are the problem. Amara's lips pressed into a thin line, not out of anger, but recognition. She had heard confessions like this before, though rarely with such honesty. Lisa, Amara said gently, you're not the first to come to that realization. But the question isn't whether you see it now. It's what you're going to do with it. Lisa met her gaze, something fragile but determined flickering in her eyes. I want to do better, Lisa said firmly. Not just for me, but for the people who stand at that counter every day. Amara studied her carefully, searching for the cracks, the places where doubt might still linger. But Lisa's expression held steady, even as her hands trembled slightly in her lap. Amara nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch between them like a bridge. That's a start, Amara said quietly. Lisa's shoulders relaxed, and she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I brought this, Lisa said, nudging the folder toward Amara. It's a proposal I've been working on with some of the other gate agents about improving how we handle customer interactions. Especially for priority passengers. I wanted to get your opinion. Amara raised an eyebrow. Her curiosity piqued. She opened the folder, skimming the pages of handwritten notes and policy suggestions. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot, but it was more than Amara had expected. Lisa, Amara said, glancing up, this is good, but it's not enough to write new rules. You have to change the way people think before they ever get to the counter. Lisa nodded. I know, but it's a place to start. Amara closed the folder, tapping it lightly against the table. It is, she agreed, but remember, policy can't fix what people refuse to confront. The real work happens in the quiet moments when no one's watching. Lisa's expression grew somber, but she nodded in understanding. I won't forget that, Lisa said. Amara leaned back in her chair, letting the weight of the conversation settle around them. You're not the same person who stood behind that counter a month ago, Amara observed. Lisa smiled faintly. I hope not. Amara returned the smile, though it carried the quiet knowing of someone who had walked this road many times before. As Lisa stood to leave, she hesitated by the door, glancing back one last time. Thank you, Lisa said softly. Amara nodded, watching as Lisa disappeared into the crowd beyond the lounge. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Amara was left alone once more, the weight of unfinished things still resting in the air. But this time, it felt just a little lighter. Some battles don't end, they fade. Amara Collins knew this better than most. She'd lived long enough to understand that racism rarely announces itself with fists or fire. More often, it wears the face of politeness, hides in the fine print, slips through the cracks of ordinary days. That was the thing about prejudice, it didn't need to roar. A whisper was often enough. It had been nearly 3 months since the incident at Gate 14. 3 months since Lisa Morris had looked Amara in the eye and mistaken her for someone who didn't belong. Now, as Amara sat in her office overlooking the city skyline, she wondered if Lisa remembered that day as vividly as she did. There was no grand confrontation left to unfold. No letters of apology in the mail. Instead, there were the smaller things. Emails from Jordan Reynolds updating her on progress. Quiet acknowledgments from people who hadn't spoken up when it mattered. Even Lisa, who had returned to her post, had sent a brief, hesitant message weeks ago, thanking Amara for her time and for not turning her into a symbol of corporate failure. But none of it erased what had happened. And Amara didn't expect it to. She returned to the airport that Friday. Not for business, but because unfinished things have a way of pulling people back. The terminal felt the same, unchanged in the way airports always are. Eternally moving but somehow frozen in time. Amara approached the counter, her membership card cool between her fingers. A young man stood behind the desk, his uniform crisp, his smile practiced. Good afternoon, he said. May I see your card? She slid it across the counter without a word, watching as he scanned it with the ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. A small green light flickered on the screen. Valid. He smiled again, returning the card with both hands. Polite and precise. Thank you for flying with us, Ms. Collins. You're all set. It was seamless, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, as Amara stepped away, she couldn't shake the weight of how ordinary it felt. Because the truth was, that wasn't ordinary. Not for her. Not in places like this. She glanced back once, half expecting to see Lisa's familiar face behind the counter. But the young man remained alone, greeting the next passenger with the same polite nod. It was such a simple thing, being seen and not doubted. And yet, it felt like standing on unfamiliar ground. She found Jordan Reynolds near Gate 23, speaking quietly with a supervisor. His eyes caught hers as she approached, and he excused himself from the conversation. "I thought you might be here," he said with a faint smile. "Habit," Amara replied. "I wanted to see if the world had changed while I was away." Jordan chuckled, though the sound was more tired than amused. "I like to think we've made progress," he offered. Amara raised an eyebrow. "Progress is a funny thing, Jordan. It's only visible in hindsight." Jordan's smile faded slightly, and he nodded, as if turning her words over in his mind. "There's something I wanted to tell you," he said after a beat. "Lisa put in for a mentorship program last week. She's training new gate agents now." Amara's eyes narrowed slightly. "I didn't expect that," she said. "Neither did I," Jordan admitted, "but maybe that's the point." Amara crossed her arms, watching the gate attendants usher passengers toward the jet bridge. "Let's hope she teaches them what she's learned," Amara replied, though her tone carried no certainty. Jordan glanced at her, studying her expression. "You don't think it's enough," he said. Amara turned toward him fully, letting the weight of the moment stretch between them. "Jordan," she said softly, "people like Lisa can change. I believe that, but the question isn't whether she's learned something. It's whether the next person standing at that counter doesn't have to prove they belong in the first place." Jordan's gaze dropped for a moment, and when he looked back up, there was something different in his face, a quiet understanding he hadn't carried before. "You're right," he said quietly. Amara offered a small nod, not out of satisfaction, but acknowledgement. "I know." Later, as Amara walked toward her gate, she felt the weight of familiar eyes on her. Passengers watched without watching, casual glances that flickered and fell away as if the act of seeing her was enough to unsettle something in them. She had grown used to it. But this time, she met their gazes without blinking. Because the truth, the kind that people don't like to say out loud, is that some burdens are carried long before they're spoken. And Amara Collins wasn't in the habit of letting silence win.